The photograph was never meant to be examined. It was meant to be trusted. The kind of image you glance at once, smile softly, and move past without a second thought. A mother stands on a wooden porch, her arms wrapped tightly around her children, as if the world beyond the frame cannot reach them. The light is gentle. The moment feels safe. Her smile is calm, reassuring, loving. It is the kind of photograph families frame and hang in hallways. The kind passed down through generations, tucked into albums, carried through moves and losses because it represents something pure. Stability, protection, love. Nothing about it feels threatening. Nothing about it asks questions. And that is exactly why it worked. The woman in the photograph knew what people expected to see. She understood the power of appearances, especially in a time when no one wanted to look too closely at what happened inside a home. So she gave them what they wanted. A smile. A mother holding her children close. A moment that looked complete. But photographs do not only capture what we want remembered. They also capture what cannot hide forever. If you study the image just a little longer than intended, something begins to feel wrong. Not enough to alarm you. Not enough to send you searching for answers. Just enough to unsettle you in a way you can't explain. A hesitation. A quiet discomfort. The kind that creeps in slowly, whispering that this image may not be telling the whole truth. The children look relaxed, but their grip on their mother is firm. Almost protective. The porch is neat, but the house behind them feels closed off, and the mother's posture upright. Rigid feels less like ease and more like control. Like someone holding themselves together for just a few seconds longer. Then your eyes drift. Not to her face, not to her eyes, but to her hands. They are placed carefully, deliberately, one resting on a child's shoulder, the other curved protectively around a small waist. At first glance, they seem gentle, but look closer. Just a fraction closer. Dark shadows circle her wrists. Not where light naturally falls. Not where fabric should crease. They are uneven, heavy, repeated. These are not shadows. These are not mistakes. These are marks. Marks that were never meant to be obvious, only visible to someone who knew what to look for. Someone who understood that trauma leaves patterns. That pain repeats itself in familiar ways. The woman knew this. She dressed for concealment. She smiled for distraction. She posed for history. Because this photograph was not taken to preserve happiness. It was taken to leave evidence. A silent confession hidden in plain sight. A truth embedded beneath love and lace and light. And once you see it, this stops being a family portrait. It becomes a warning. Welcome back to Truth Uncaged. This isn't a channel about jump scares or urban legends. We don't rely on rumors or exaggeration. Here, we uncover the stories that were deliberately buried, stories that only survived because someone, somewhere, left behind proof. Proof most people were never meant to notice. Before we go any further, I want you to slow down. Not just the video, but your mind. Picture the photograph we just described. A mother standing on a wooden porch. 3 children pressed against her sides. The year is 1926. The place is Seattle. There is nothing violent in the frame. No blood, no visible fear. In fact, everything about the image feels carefully controlled. The children are clean. Their clothes are neat. The house behind them looks modest but cared for. And the mother looks exactly the way a mother is supposed to look. Calm, strong, safe. This is the kind of photograph people trust instantly. The kind you never think to question, because questioning it feels unnecessary, almost disrespectful. It looks like proof that everything was fine. And that's why this story matters. Because history isn't just written in documents and police reports. Sometimes it's hidden inside moments that appear ordinary. Sometimes the most important evidence is disguised as something comforting. So I want to ask you something. If you were holding this photograph in your hands, what would you notice first? Would your eyes go to the children? To the way they lean into their mother, trusting her completely? Would you focus on her face, her smile, trying to decide whether it feels real or staged? Or would you do what almost everyone else has done for nearly a century? Look at it once and move on. Most people don't linger on photographs like this. They accept them at face value because photographs feel honest, mechanical, objective, but cameras don't understand the truth. They only record what they're shown. And sometimes what they're shown is carefully constructed. This photograph wasn't taken in a moment of joy. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't casual. It was planned. Every detail, the clothing, the posture, the placement of hands was chosen for a reason. Not to draw attention, but to avoid it, to pass inspection. And one woman, decades later, noticed something that didn't belong. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something history had ignored because it didn't want to look closely enough. In the comments, I want you to tell me honestly, what would your eyes be drawn to first? The smile? The children? The setting? Or would you, like most people, miss the truth completely? Because the moment someone finally noticed it, everything about this photograph changed. And the story it was hiding could no longer stay silent. Seattle in 1926 was a city built on silence. From the outside, it looked like progress. Shipyards hummed along the waterfront. Streetcars rattled through neighborhoods packed with workers and their families. The city was growing, modernizing, trying to convince itself that the worst years were behind it. But beneath that movement was tension. Working-class neighborhoods were crowded and loud children playing in narrow streets. Men arguing outside taverns, factory whistles slicing through the morning air. Noise filled the public spaces. Inside the home, there was a different rule. What happened behind closed doors stayed there. Domestic violence wasn't discussed in newspapers or whispered about in polite conversation. There was no language for it that didn't blame the woman. If a husband drank too much, lost his temper, or became violent, it was considered a private failure, something a wife was expected to endure quietly. There were no shelters, no hotlines, no safe houses. A woman had no legal right to escape without losing everything: her home, her reputation, sometimes even her children. Police rarely intervened. Courts almost never sided with wives. Survival meant silence, and silence was enforced. Bruises were hidden beneath long sleeves. Fear was disguised as obedience. Pain was swallowed and carried alone. In this world, photographs served a very specific purpose. They weren't meant to document the truth. They were meant to perform it. Family portraits were staged declarations, proof that everything was fine, that a household was respectable, that nothing was wrong. These images were often the only permanent record a family left behind, and they were expected to show harmony even when harmony didn't exist. When families posed for the camera, they smiled, not because they were happy, but because they had to. A smile could protect a reputation. A smile could prevent questions. A smile could convince outsiders that everything inside those walls was normal. And most of the time, it worked. Photographs like these passed through decades untouched, unquestioned, treated as innocent keepsakes rather than historical documents. No one thought to look closer. No one thought to ask what had been edited out of the frame. That's why this photograph matters. Because one woman understood the rules and then bent them. She knew how the world would see her image. She knew people would accept the smile without hesitation. She knew no one would suspect a thing. And she used that expectation. Instead of erasing the truth, she hid it in plain sight. Not in her face, not in her posture, but in the smallest details, details that would only reveal themselves to someone willing to look beyond what they were told to see. This photograph was taken in a time when women weren't allowed to speak openly about what was happening to them. So she didn't speak. She documented. And in doing so, she refused to let the truth disappear with her, even in a city built to make sure it did. Nearly 70 years later, the truth surfaced in a place where forgotten things go to wait out their final years. A narrow auction house in Portland. Dust in the air. Fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Retired photographer Elizabeth Morgan stood between folding tables stacked with objects no one wanted anymore. Broken clocks. War medals. Yellowed letters tied together with string. These were the remains of other people's lives, stripped of context and value. Elizabeth wasn't there looking for answers. She was looking for forgotten lives. For decades, she had documented stories no one thought were worth preserving: abandoned buildings, closed factories, portraits of people history had stepped over. Even in retirement, she couldn't stop searching. That's when she saw the box. A cardboard container pushed beneath a table, labeled in black marker, "Mixed ephemera, $5. Inside were the usual remnants. Postcards with half-written messages. Receipts faded into illegibility. Loose photographs curled at the edges, their faces long separated from their names. Elizabeth sifted through them carefully. Then her fingers touched something different, heavier, thicker, an 8x10 mounted portrait. The board was stiff, professionally cut. This wasn't a casual snapshot. It had weight to it, physically and emotionally. Elizabeth lifted it from the box and immediately noticed the quality. Sharp focus, balanced lighting, intentional composition. A mother stood at the center, her children gathered close. It was the kind of photograph you'd expect to see framed above a fireplace, respectable, ordinary, and yet, Elizabeth had spent 40 years behind a camera. She felt it immediately. There was something wrong, not obvious, not dramatic dot, just a quiet disturbance beneath the surface, like a sound you hear in another room, but can't quite place. Her instincts tightened. This photograph was hiding something. She turned it over. On the back, written in faded pencil, were simple words: "Mama and Us, Seattle, June 1926. No last name. No story, just enough to anchor it in time." Elizabeth turned the photograph back again, and her breath stopped. Not because of the faces. The mother's smile was gentle. The children looked calm. Everything about the image should have felt reassuring. But Elizabeth's eyes weren't trained to linger on expressions. They were trained to study details. Her gaze dropped to the hands. The mother's hands were placed carefully, almost deliberately, one resting on a child's shoulder, the other curved protectively around a small frame. At first glance, they looked natural. At second glance, they didn't. Dark bands encircled her wrists, uneven, blotched, not symmetrical. Not shadows cast by fabric or light. Elizabeth leaned closer, heart slowing as recognition set in. She had seen these marks before, hundreds of times. In shelters, in hospitals, in portraits taken of women who survived what they never spoke about. These weren't accidents. They were bruises, old ones layered over newer ones. And in that quiet auction house, surrounded by objects no one cared to remember, Elizabeth realized she was holding something dangerous. Not a photograph, but a confession that had waited nearly 70 years to be seen. Back home, Elizabeth didn't hang the photograph on a wall. She didn't place it in a drawer. She carried it straight to her work table, the same place where she had spent decades developing film, restoring negatives, and studying images that refused to give up their secrets easily. She turned on the magnifying lamp. The soft circle of light fell across the photograph, isolating it from the rest of the room. In that glow, the image stopped being a family portrait and became a piece of evidence. That's when the truth surfaced. Dark rings circled both of the woman's wrists, not faint, not accidental. They were deep, repeated, uneven in shape, darker in some places than others. Elizabeth adjusted the lamp, shifting the angle of the light, searching for any explanation that would make them disappear. They didn't. These were not shadows cast by folds in fabric, not chemical flaws from aging paper, not mistakes made by an old lens. Elizabeth recognized them instantly. She had spent years photographing domestic abuse survivors, women who had agreed to be seen only because someone finally believed them. She knew the difference between coincidence and pattern. And this was a pattern. The bruises wrapped around the wrists in a way that told a story without words. Pressure applied from the outside, hands gripping. Force repeated over time. These marks didn't come from a single moment. They came from restraint, from being held in place, from being overpowered, from being trapped. Elizabeth leaned back, the weight of recognition settling in, yet something didn't match what she expected. The woman's posture was upright. Her shoulders were squared. Her head was lifted just slightly, as though refusing to bow. Her smile, calm and composed, didn't waver under scrutiny. This wasn't the expression of someone unaware. This wasn't denial. This was control. Elizabeth realized something unsettling. The woman knew the bruises were visible. She knew the camera would record them. Cameras are merciless that way. They remember what people try to forget. And still, she posed. She didn't hide her hands behind her back. She didn't turn her wrists away from the lens. She didn't ask for retakes. This was not ignorance. This was my intention. Elizabeth imagined the moment the shutter clicked, the stillness, the brief silence where the woman held her breath and allowed herself to be seen exactly as she was, not as a victim, but as a witness. And then the realization struck, slow, chilling, and impossible to ignore. This woman didn't know if she would get another chance. Another photograph, another moment of proof, another opportunity to leave something behind. This image wasn't taken for nostalgia. It was taken in case she disappeared, in case her voice never reached anyone. The camera had remembered what history tried to erase. And now, nearly a century later, someone was finally listening. Elizabeth knew instinct alone wouldn't be enough. A photograph could suggest, it could imply. But to expose the truth, it needed context. So she began making calls. Archivists, local historians, university collections that specialized in early 20th century Seattle. Most of them had never seen the photograph before. Some dismissed it immediately, another anonymous family portrait among thousands. But one historian paused long enough to ask a question no one else had. Do you know who took it? That question opened everything. In the 1920s, Seattle had dozens of itinerant photographers, men and women, who went door to door offering affordable portraits to working class families. Many of their records were lost. A few survived. One name resurfaced. Dorothy Hayes. She wasn't famous. She didn't work for newspapers or studios. She worked neighborhoods: Georgetown, Beacon Hill, South Park, carrying her camera case from house to house, documenting ordinary lives, and her ledgers still existed. Bound volumes stored in a climate-controlled archive, filled with neat handwriting and brief observations meant only for her own reference. Elizabeth requested access. What they found changed everything. One entry stopped them cold. June 18, 1926. Georgetown. Client requested a portrait with 3 children. Noted extensive bruising on arms and wrists. Client insisted on long sleeves. Despite the warm weather, requested copies quickly. Wanted children to remember her smiling. Elizabeth read the lines again and again. Dorothy Hayes hadn't editorialized. She hadn't speculated. She had simply recorded what she saw, just as her camera had done. The final line was the most haunting. wanted children to remember her smiling. The ledger noted delivery on June 20th. 3 days later, police records documented an incident at the same address. The woman's husband was found dead at the bottom of the basement stairs. Official cause of death: accidental fall. No investigation followed, but neighbors had stories. Arguments that carried through thin walls, screams that stopped suddenly, violence everyone pretended not to hear. Still, no charges were filed. No inquest reopened. The system moved on, and then the woman vanished. She did not appear in city directories the following year. Her name disappeared from census rolls. There were no remarriage records, no death certificate in Seattle under her name. Only absence. Her children reappeared years later in school records living with relatives, their mother listed simply as unknown. Elizabeth sat in the archive reading room long after the files were returned. The photograph no longer felt ambiguous. It felt deliberate. The woman had known something was coming, or had already happened enough times to understand where the path ended. She had chosen documentation over silence. Not to accuse, not to explain, but to leave behind something undeniable. The ledger, the photograph, the timing, it all aligned. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a message sent forward in time. And it had finally been received. Her name was Helen. Elizabeth discovered it by tracing the faint breadcrumbs left in census records and city directories. Helen had survived Seattle only to disappear from the official narrative. By 1930, she appeared again in Tacoma, a widow working as a seamstress. Her children listed as school-aged, alive, and intact. The transition from one city to another was clean. No paperwork suggesting relocation, no explanations for the sudden absence. Just life quietly rebuilt. She had chosen survival over exposure. The children had survived too. William, James, Mary, names dryly inked into census ledgers decades later, ordinary in their simplicity. But the story behind those names was extraordinary. Helen worked herself into exhaustion, taking in laundry, mending clothes for neighbors, sewing late into the night, making sure every meal was served, every lesson learned, every scrape tended. Her body bore the marks of labor and old violence. Her mind carried the weight of choices few could fathom. And yet, through all of it, she preserved a secret that only Elizabeth had begun to uncover. Dorothy Hayes' diary revealed it. Elizabeth. Read slowly, the words whispering across the decades. Now my children will remember me smiling. Not happy, not fortunate, not safe, smiling. The phrasing was deliberate. Hayes had captured the exact words Helen spoke when receiving her portraits. And the diary entry noted the pause, the subtle relief, the almost imperceptible exhalation that followed as Helen closed the door behind her, as if she were already becoming a memory. Elizabeth reread the line. Her stomach tightened. The realization struck slowly, like a shadow moving across a room. Helen had taken the photograph knowing it might be the last. Not just the last portrait, the last time she would be seen whole, intact, unbroken. She had created evidence, a record, something undeniable that survived the frailty of human memory. Helen wasn't merely documenting love, she was documenting survival. The smile on her face, the careful placement of her hands, the insistence. On long sleeves in June, it wasn't vanity, it wasn't convention. It was a strategy. She understood that life could end abruptly, violently, unpredictably. That history often ignored the silent sufferings of women. That her children might grow up without knowing the details of what had been endured unless she left proof. And so she left it. The photograph, the pose, the ledger entries, even the hurried request for quick copies, all were part of a plan meticulously executed. She had become her own archivist, her own historian, her own witness. Elizabeth stared at the photograph again. The bruised wrists, now magnified under her lamp, no longer represented merely pain, they were declarations. Marks of endurance, silent testimony. Helen's survival was not just for herself. It was for her children, for the memory she wanted them to inherit, for the story that might otherwise have vanished into obscurity. And in that quiet, dimly lit study in Portland, Elizabeth realized the chilling truth. Helen had anticipated the worst, and she had prepared, not for revenge, not for justice, not even for recognition. She had prepared for history to remember, because sometimes survival itself is a quiet act of rebellion, and sometimes leaving proof is the only way to escape being erased. Decades had passed. Time had worn the edges of memory, softened the sharpness of pain, and wrapped the past in layers of routine and silence. But Elizabeth had persisted. Weeks of correspondence, city records, newspaper clippings, and patient detective work had finally led her to them. William, Mary, two of Helen's children, now adults, had lived full lives unaware of the hidden testament their mother had left behind. Elizabeth arranged a meeting in a small, quiet cafe, far from the intrusion of strangers. When William arrived, his eyes held the same determination Helen had once displayed in the photograph. Mary came later, clutching the original portrait as if it were the last fragile piece of a vanished world. They recognized the image instantly: the wooden porch, the modest Seattle house, the mother's radiant smile. Mary had kept the photograph at her bedside for decades, framing it carefully, protecting it from the dulling weight of years. But she had never truly examined it. Not the hands, not the wrists, not the story hidden in plain sight. Helen had never intended for her children to see those marks. Not while they were young. Not while fear still clung to the edges of their memories. The evidence was for someone else. Someone who could understand. Someone who could bear witness. Elizabeth gently laid a copy of the photograph on the table, alongside the magnified sections highlighting the bruises, the ledger entries, and the diary passages. William and Mary leaned forward, hesitant. Mary's breath caught, her eyes widened, her hands shook. She had always thought she knew the story. She had always believed in her mother's strength, her resilience, her love. But now, staring at the evidence, the realization struck her like a physical blow. Her mother's suffering had been real, but more than that, it had been deliberate. The smile had been a choice. The pose had been a strategy. Every detail had been calculated to protect, to preserve, to endure. And it wasn't just about enduring, it was about control. Helen had chosen how history would remember her. She had chosen what her children would see, not a victim broken by violence, not a woman defined by fear, a protector. Mary's shoulders sagged as tears fell. She didn't collapse from anger. She didn't fall into despair. She collapsed under the weight of understanding. Helen had taken her pain, absorbed it, and transformed it into something larger, a shield, a narrative, a legacy. The photograph had been her weapon and her gift. William placed a hand over his sister's, his own eyes glistening. "She made sure we knew love," he whispered, "even when we didn't see the danger, even when we couldn't understand." Elizabeth watched, feeling the decades of silence and secrecy dissolve in that small cafe. The hidden testimony of bruised wrists, of long sleeves in June, of a smile meant to deceive only the world, had finally reached the intended witnesses. Helen's story was no longer a secret, no longer a photograph in a dusty box, no longer a ledger entry tucked in an archive. It was alive, understood, and honored. For the first time, William and Mary saw the full measure of their mother's courage. And in seeing it, they carried forward a legacy not of fear, but of protection, resilience, and deliberate love. Helen had endured. Helen had survived. Helen had triumphed. And now, her children finally knew. Her choice had been realized. Not remembered for suffering, but remembered for strength. Helen's story didn't end in Tacoma. Long after Elizabeth had returned to Portland, long after William and Mary had seen the truth of their mother's courage, the photograph found a new audience. It hung in the Historical Society exhibition, framed under archival glass, accompanied by the documents, the magnified sections, and the narrative of survival. Visitors wandered slowly through the gallery, murmuring softly, captivated by faces frozen in time, but one woman stopped dead. She was young, barely in her 20s, with eyes that darted nervously from the photograph to the floor and back again. Elizabeth noticed the tremor in her hands, the way she gripped her bag as if it were a lifeline. Something in Helen's image, her smile, her posture, her hands wrapped protectively around the children, struck a chord the woman could not ignore. The gallery was quiet, almost eerily so, and yet the photograph seemed to speak. The woman sank onto the bench in front of it, tears streaming down her face. She whispered to herself, words barely audible, "I can do it. I can leave. I can protect him." She was living in fear. Weeks of abuse, months of planning, the constant dread that any wrong move could escalate into irreversible danger. Helen's image offered a different kind of proof, a blueprint of courage, a silent instruction that survival was possible. Elizabeth watched, knowing that Helen's legacy had taken on a life beyond history books and ledger entries. It had become active, immediate, and real. The woman spent hours in the gallery, studying every detail of the photograph, the bruised wrists, the careful pose, the unwavering smile. Each element whispered instructions on strategy, discretion, and hope. Weeks later, Elizabeth received a package. Inside was a photograph, a mother standing on the porch of her modest apartment, her young son at her side, both smiling. Simple, ordinary, yet filled with meaning. On the back, in neat handwriting, the woman had written, "For my son to remember his mother was brave." Elizabeth's hands shook as she held it. She traced the small hand resting in the mother's, the sunlight catching on their faces. The same decision, the same love. Separated by 71 years, across time and geography, the photograph had created a bridge, a testament that courage could be taught, passed down, inherited, even silently. Helen's photograph had survived decades of obscurity, of fragile memories and yellowed ledgers. But it did not survive in vain. It had inspired a new act of survival, a new story of protection, a new mother ready to ensure the safety and freedom of her child, armed with nothing more than the example left behind in a single deceptively simple image. Elizabeth placed the photograph carefully on her wall, alongside Helen's original. Two mothers, two moments in time, two acts of quiet, defiant courage. And in that moment, it became clear, the story of survival, of deliberate love, of refusing to be broken, was not bound by decades. It traveled through time, waiting for the next person brave enough to see it, understand it, and act. Helen's choice had echoed far beyond her own life. Her photograph had saved another life, and it could save many more. This photograph was never meant to be ordinary. It wasn't a simple family memory tucked into a dusty album. It wasn't a keepsake to decorate a parlor wall. It was far more deliberate, far more haunting. It was evidence, a record, a silent declaration. Helen understood that photographs could do more than freeze a moment. They could carry truth across generations. And in her case, that truth was urgent, almost desperate. The smile she wore, radiant and unbroken, was a mask, yes. But the hands. Beneath it, the hands resting protectively on her children, the wrists hidden by long sleeves, told the story no one else was meant to see. Elizabeth's discovery of those hands changed everything. For decades, Helen's life could have been written off as quiet compliance, a mother quietly enduring hardship. But those hands told a different tale. They whispered of resilience, of courage, of a woman determined to shield her children from fear, to leave a record that would survive her own silence. Helen understood something profound. Sometimes the bravest act is not the one everyone notices. Sometimes it is choosing what survives you. She let her love live, crystallized in a photograph. She let her fear, her pain, and her suffering remain hidden, buried in shadows that only the observant would uncover. She preserved the image of hope, even when she knew the world could not yet understand the reality beneath it. And now, decades later, her hands speak louder than words ever could. They speak to historians, to survivors, to ordinary people who might see themselves reflected in the quiet struggle of a woman from Seattle, 1926. Those marks, once invisible, have become testimony. They have become instructions. They have become an inspiration. Elizabeth watched as Helen's children, and even strangers separated by decades, finally saw what their eyes had never truly grasped. They learned that survival is not always loud. It is quiet, meticulous, and patient. It is a photograph taken with care. A smile maintained even as the world threatens to break you. A choice to protect others even when your own strength is faltering. The story did not end with Helen's death. It continued through William and Mary, through the young mother who saw the photograph and found the courage to escape, through everyone who now knows the price of survival and the power of deliberate action. The photograph became more than a historical artifact. It became a living, breathing lesson, a warning, a promise. And the hands never lied. They spoke of pain endured and love preserved, of choices made in silence, in secrecy, with calculation and bravery, of a woman who refused to be remembered for suffering, who refused to let fear define her legacy. Those hands carried the weight of truth that the world was only beginning to understand. Helen's photograph, once hidden in a cardboard box, now hangs as testimony, not just to what she survived, but to how she survived. Not just to what was done to her, but to what she did for those she loved. The smile was her gift. The hands were her confession. And now at last, that confession is uncaged. It is seen, it is understood, it is remembered. And in that recognition, Helen's courage becomes immortal. Because sometimes the smallest details, bruised wrists, careful sleeves, a mother's steady hands are enough to tell the story history forgot. The hands never lied, and neither will we. If Helen's hands could speak across decades, imagine what the forgotten corners of history are still trying to tell us. Don't just scroll past. Look closer. Question what you see. Comment below. What detail in the photograph did you notice first? Did you see the warning before it was revealed? Every story like Helen's deserves to be uncovered. Share this video and help uncage the truths hiding in plain sight. Subscribe and turn on notifications for Truth Uncaged, because the shadows of history are still whispering, and you don't want to miss what they reveal next.